Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. As soon as the girl opened her eyes, she realized that she was definitely dead, for she remembered it perfectly well. However, at that moment she found herself in some unknown place, and not even in her native body. She had contentedly long blonde hair and thin white fingers like a doll's. And besides, the setting reminded her more of the Middle Ages than the modern world she lived in. If she were alive, she'd be looking up at the white hospital ceiling. And that's because she was hit by a car, and she'd be in the hospital for sure. The girl was just terrified of what was happening. She wondered what had happened and how such a thing was possible. And besides, she was very interested in the question of who was lying next to her. After all, on the second part of the bed was a dark-haired man, and he looked pretty strange to her. After all, she'd never seen such a look before. For a while the girl was still pondering, and then she suddenly realized that she had seen this sort of thing many times in the short stories she had read. She suddenly thought that maybe her death wasn't real. The last thing she remembers is being hit by a huge truck on her way to the college entrance exams. She was certainly not breaking the rules and was walking in the crosswalk. She was just unlucky enough to be in that place at that time. To her good fortune, the girl was an orphan, and she supposed that if she had a real family, they would surely be grieving and mourning her death right now. She also suggested that if she had any friends, they would probably be sad too. But the girl suggested that it was likely that after her death, her soul had somehow ended up in this novel. She also thought about how she would be very lucky if her life in this place was any different from the worst of society. She decided that if this was all really true, then she needed to find out who she was and what this place was right away. So she tried to remember what she had read from the last. She suddenly smiled as she thought about the fact that she might end up being the main character. However, even if she were to live her life as a minor character with a quiet fate, it would be a good thing. At that moment, she suddenly heard some strange sounds behind her, and when she turned her head to the side, she saw that the man who was lying next to her had suddenly woken up. And it was really so. The guy sat down on the bed and began to look around. The girl at that moment thought that he was incredibly handsome while sleeping, but now, when he opened his beautiful eyes, he was even better. She couldn't still believe that such a thing in life could really happen, and it had happened to her. The girl had never seen such beautiful people before, so she suddenly began to worry, for she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. She realized that she had to at least talk to him first, and when she opened her mouth she couldn't make a single sound, only a casual hiccup. The man looked at her in surprise and said nothing. The girl was getting even more worried because she didn't know what it meant. Then he just turned away and started to get up from his seat, walking away. The girl thought about the fact that she must have gotten too nervous, and also so nervous that she made some involuntary strange sound that startled him. But at that moment, a man walked over to the bed and yanked a large string that hung from their corner. Then someone knocked on their room. The man said in a low and pleasant voice that they could come in. When the girl heard his voice, she was very surprised, because she thought he would sound different. However, it was pretty cool. At that moment, a maid came into their room inquiring if they wished to take a bath immediately upon waking. The man just stared at her for a while and afterward, coming closer, said that he would probably do just that. The girl in turn continued to sit on the bed, and as she listened to this dialogue, it seemed to her that he answered it rather coldly. She'd really like to know where she is, but she can't give herself away like that, so she started to get out of bed in order to look around at least. She supposed she might be able to learn something from this maid, for she was a servant, and they, as she knew, were not supposed to ask many questions. Then the girl approached the maid and asked her what her name was. The maid immediately became anxious, and answered in a trembling voice that her name was Marie. Then she asked Maria what her own name was. The maid was incredibly surprised at such a question from her mistress, but said she was Delise von Vannister, and having said these words, she bowed in respect. When Delise heard this, she was very surprised, because she realized that she was the main villain from a novel that she had just recently read, and it was called Flowers in the Imperial Palace. She suddenly realized that if she was pretending to be a villain, then the person who woke up next to her was Roan, and he's actually her favorite character in her entire lived life. This was her dear Roan, and she loved him incredibly, for he was not only the most beautiful character in the story, but also the most intelligent. In fact, from the novel Flowers in the Imperial Palace. While the protagonist falls in love with the crown prince, Roan is a minor character who is completely at her mercy, and his wife Delise in the chat room ignores him and even mocks him, and the girl now cannot believe that she really had such an honor to be this character. She didn't understand why she was this particular villain, and not, for example, the main character or just some insignificant passing girl. It even made her dizzy, and she couldn't keep her feet up, falling to the floor. Delise bullied her husband because he was the Duke's illegitimate child, and it was like a stigma on his bloodline. And Roan was the child of the previous Duke of Winchester and a maid who had spent only one night with him by chance. And because of this, the boy was despised in his father's family. No one loved him, and everyone only judged poor Roan. Perhaps it all came to this because his mom was the only person he could rely on, but she became very weak after giving birth. The woman almost never got out of her bed and kept apologizing to the boy for being sick and unable to care for him. And without his dear mother, the boy was very lonely, and his heart was incredibly heavy. His mother kept saying that she was terribly sorry that she had failed to protect him and subjected him to such a terrible fate. The whole world turned its back on poor Roan when he was but 3 years old, and on the day of his mother's funeral, the Duke of Winchester said that he was the only stain of disgrace on his name, so he told the boy to remember it for the rest of his life. At that moment, the boy was already having a hard time, because he had lost the only person who loved him, and his father had dishonored him among all people. The only change that occurred in the life of this illegitimate child was when it was discovered that the Duchess was completely infertile, and the Duke's health was getting worse and worse. So the man who was helping to sort out his affairs said he needed to appoint a successor already, so that it wouldn't be too late. The man, who was really weakening by the day, said there was no suitable candidate in his family for the role. The aide asked him what he thought about adoption. The Duke was quite old by then, but he still insisted on his own way and refused the idea. He explained that it had to be his blood to continue the bloodline. Roan had grown older by then, and was always practicing to improve his sword skills. Then the Duke turned to his aide and asked him to bring that child after all, for he had no choice but to do so. The Duke, who had no heir other than that illegitimate son, turned his attention to Roan, who had quite a bit of potential. And later, he even began to be called the incarnation of the Blue Wolf. In order to strengthen his family's position, he married Delise, daughter of the Marquis of Caesar. However, Roan's misfortunes certainly did not end there. Certainly, he was beginning to be somewhat accepted and understood in high society. However, his wife never respected him. One day, she even poured a glass of cold water in his face and said that it was no longer funny, and she would definitely like to become an empress. Delise kept yelling at him and wondering if he really thought she would want to be just some bastard son's wife forever. Yes, even breathing the same air with him was simply unseemly, so she always asked him not to even come near her. She was really physically disgusted by this man, and she didn't even hide it. Having lost her mother at an early age, Delise became the sole love of the Marquis Caesar. She was rude to Roan and also humiliated him in every way possible. She was literally just a disgusting character that you don't even want to hang out with. And so, in the end, after a long quarrel and gossip, Delise divorced Roan. Trying to poison the main character, she was exposed by the protagonist, and after that the girl was simply banished outside the empire. Now Delise was very worried about her fate as a villain, and the end that awaited her. If she had been in the heroine's shoes, she would have tried to develop a romance with Roan from the beginning. She'd never really understood, even back when reading the novel, what was so good about this slob prince, and Roan had always come first for her. But at that moment she was suddenly approached by Mary, who was still standing beside her, and inquired why she continued to address her formally. Delise panicked a bit and didn't know what she should even do now, since she somehow needed to hide her situation. In fact, she's only read the parts where Roan appears all the time, so she doesn't know how the girl usually behaves. Oh, and besides, after Delise and Roan's divorce, her stake and appearance in the story is greatly diminished. Suddenly, the maid, seeing the expression on Mistress's face, anxiously inquired if she was all right. The girl immediately looked at her and thought about the fact that she should at least start with something simple. Delise thought her legs and arms were about to give out from the excitement, so she had to try something. The maid kept looking at her in surprise and trying to draw Madame's attention to herself. for she did not listen to her at all. And then after a while the girl saw Delise crying and asked in a quiet and trembling voice who she was and what this place was all about. When Maria heard this, she was horrified. She turned to Her Majesty and asked if she really didn't remember anything. Delise continued to cry and said that it was true. She only knew some passages, but she still didn't understand anything. The maid immediately ran to the exit and told the girl to wait a while, for she would call the doctor right away to find out. Soon the doctor came and inquired if the girl did not remember anything about herself at all. He was quite surprised and asked her a lot of different questions. He even asked her to write something, and then pointing to a vase of flowers, asked if she knew what it was even called. And soon after an in-depth analysis, the doctor said that she hasn't forgotten information about the real world and remembers how to hold a pen and write. However, it seems to him that she has lost all memories of herself. It was very hard for him to say when her memory would come back, and he added that it could come back right now, but that was very unlikely. Then the maid looked at him in surprise and asked if she really might not come back at all. The doctor, thinking about it, said that he thought it was necessary to observe first, and he also thought it was necessary to tell the Duke. Delise in turn made a neutral expression and said that she was fine with them telling the Duke about it, but she herself hoped it would be pretty good. Then the doctor bowed and said that since everything was settled, he would be on his way, for he had some more important calls to make. After that, the man left, and the girl thought that since he had said that he had to tell the Duke about it, the first thing he would probably do was to go to Roan to inform him of the whole situation. As the door slammed shut, Mary approached the Duchess and said that she usually always took a bath after sleeping. The maid also anxiously said that she was probably feeling dizzy right now, but perhaps she would agree to have the bathing water prepared for her. Delise, smiling, said that of course she agreed, and also added that she straight up relied on her. Mary was ready to cry, and, putting her head down, said that she had never really addressed them like this respectfully. The girl immediately covered her mouth with her hand and apologized, and thought to herself that she needed to pull herself together. After all, she had been too polite in her previous life, so now she needed to drastically change herself and her behavior to those around her. She is at this point a Delis, so she must behave accordingly or everyone will suspect something. So she smiled and said that in that case, the maid could do everything as she always did. And so a few more hours had passed since then. The girl had already taken her bath and changed into her new clothes. She was sitting at the dressing table, and the maids were fixing her hair. Soon they had braided her a large braid, and Delis was very tired, for she could not believe that the Empress's morning preparations could always be so arduous. One servant girl, who had accidentally pulled her hard by the hair, immediately bowed down and apologized, telling her to have mercy on her. But the girl immediately replied that everything was fine and she should worry. She couldn't believe that her character could treat the maids so badly that they now reacted so badly to the slightest misstep. Suddenly there was a knock at their room. It was Marie, and Delise let her in at once. When the maid came in, she immediately went up to the mistress and said in her ear that she had something to tell her. The girl was immediately interested and asked what it was about. Marie would not tell in front of all the other maids. Then the mistress returned to them and said that they could be dismissed, and only Marie remained. The girls immediately bowed and started to leave. When Dallas and her personal maid were alone, the girl, putting on her earrings, inquired what she wanted to tell her. Marie in turn said that the Duke had asked her to give her something. She immediately looked at the maid and wondered what it might be. Maria replied that once outsiders found out about the memory loss, there would be a lot of rumors, so it would be good to keep things private, and he ordered the servants to keep their mouths shut. When the girl heard this, she thought that there was really no need to stir up rumors and draw attention to the situation. When she turned to the maid and wondered if there was anything else, the girl only stood there for a while, just staring at her without saying a word. It even made Delise a little uncomfortable. Then she inquired, laughing nervously, if that was all it was. Maria nervously folded her hands together and said that was it. The girl at that moment thought about the fact that it was just a formality and not a gram of emotion. But then she thought about the fact that surely, if you think back to the way Delise had set herself up with Roan, it all makes sense why everyone around her was acting this way. In fact, if the girl had been in his shoes at all, She would have looked forward to the death of her wife altogether, for it was simply impossible to live with her. Then Mary suddenly turned to her mistress with fear in her voice and said that breakfast was already served, so she suggested that she should go and eat. Delise looked very sad, but she agreed. So soon she went downstairs where the dinner table was. The girl, when she saw all this space, was very surprised. She hadn't thought there would be so much space in this manner. But suddenly she saw someone sitting at the table. When she got closer, she realized it was Roan, and she was surprised. In fact, if you look closely like this, then you can think that the creator directly put his whole soul into his appearance. And even during the reading of this novel, it turned out that he did not try so hard over the main character as he should this man. She just didn't have a sense of reality. She feels like she could make things worse by just even sitting next to him at the table. Still, she needs to try to repair her relationship with this man, because there's no way she can let her favorite character divorce her. So she slowly walked over and sat down across from him. Delise thought about the fact that she should at least try to talk to him about some casual topics first. But she was so uncomfortable that she was afraid to even look him in the eye, let alone start talking about anything. She took in a mouthful of air, thinking that the most important thing in this case was to just start a conversation, and it would go on its own from there. So with a smile, she turned to Roan and said that it was some beautiful weather this day, and she was madly enjoying it, to how warm it was outside. The servants who were present in the room were all very surprised and began to expect the Lord's reaction to this phrase. Roan was silent for a while, but he looked at her with a surprised look, and she thought it was a small victory. He hadn't even looked at her before. The girl couldn't believe that all he did was stare. However, he ignored her words. So in that case, she decided to act more decisively. Delise addressed him by name and asked if he liked the food they were served for breakfast. The servants at that moment were ready to faint, and when the girl saw their reaction, she thought that she had said something wrong, because she did not understand why everyone reacted like that. Roan in turn picked up a napkin that was lying nearby, and wiping his mouth said he liked everything. But at that moment she suddenly realized that she had made a huge mistake, because she had pretended to have lost her memory. So she shouldn't have remembered him. That's when she thought about how people are correct in saying that only smart people can lie, because they take into account even the smallest details that might give away their lies. Delise in turn proceeded to the dessert, and said in a trembling voice that she had only called him by his first name because she had heard from his servants. Then she also apologized for not inquiring, and asked if she could address him simply by his first name. The man just sat there silent for a while, completely ignoring her any questions. Delise thought her question was just silly, since she had already called him by his name before, but for a while longer the man remained silent, and then turning away from her he said she could do it if she wanted to. When she heard this, she was very surprised, for she couldn't even believe that Roan himself had answered her. But after that, the girl laughed nervously without saying another word. Then the man got up from the table and started to leave. She looked at him in surprise, and couldn't believe that he was leaving her so quickly already. After all, she had only said one word. He only looked her straight in the eyes for a few seconds as he said goodbye, and then started to leave the room. When he had finally left, the girl turned to Marie and inquired where the Duke's office was. The maid was a little surprised, but then said it was the second room down the hall in the left wing. She wondered what it was for, though. Delise, rising from her seat, said she just had one more thing to say to the Duke, which was why she asked where he was going now. And she did go, just like that, to that office. The girl thought about the fact that no matter how awful their relationship had been, she couldn't believe that they could just ignore her memory loss like that. She went to the door and just stood there for a while, thinking that she could have at least asked, for decency's sake, how she was feeling in general. Then she even opened the door without knocking, thinking of the question she was sure to hear from him that day, whether she was all right at all. But as soon as Delise opened the door, another person appeared in front of her, and it was Roan. This guy had brown eyes and brown hair. When the girl realized it was a loyal aide named David, he had been mentioned several times in the novel, and the girl doubted if this guy knew about her memory loss. After all, the Duke had said that he would try to notify fewer people about their affairs. Then David turned to the girl and in a gruff voice inquired what she was even doing in this place. Delise knew immediately from his voice that she just disgusted him. And yes, That expression on his face shows all his emotions as if on a blank sheet of paper. However, the girl was not confused and said that she wanted to see the Duke, inquiring if she could even enter. The girl didn't understand how she could expect anything different at all, since her character was just being nasty to Roan, and no one would like that. David, for his part, said that he did not believe her ladyship wished to enter the Lord's house. But then suddenly a man's voice was heard saying that she might enter. He frowned and then said that she was invited. Of course, he was completely displeased by this and didn't understand his master. However, he had to comply. Then the boy left the room, and Delise, on the contrary, came in and was silent for some time. When the door closed behind the assistant, the girl said hello to Roan. He, in turn, said that she wouldn't have come for nothing. So he asked her what was wrong. Delise was amazed that he could respond coldly to his spouse. But then she wondered if he hadn't been told what had happened to her in the first place. Roan raised his head and looked at her, wondering if she was referring to memory loss. If so, he had been told. And then he wondered if the maid hadn't relayed his words to her. After that, he went back to the papers and began to scrutinize something, and after that, to write. Delise still wouldn't give up. She said she knew that their relationship before the memory loss had been far from perfect, so she had come to talk and discuss things with him. The man thought for a moment, and then wondered in surprise. Was she really saying that she had come to have a quiet talk with him? Then he said in a sarcastic tone that since the Duchess had lost her memory, it was permanent to forget. Roan, showing no interest in the conversation, said that he couldn't even imagine what she was up to. It was better to tell her at once, though. The girl immediately screamed, saying that he had gotten it completely wrong. Unfortunately, she doesn't remember anything, but if she was really rude to him, she apologizes sincerely. When the man heard this, he even put the paper aside. After all, his wife had never asked for an apology before. Delise, for her part, turned around and started to walk away, saying that she wouldn't distract him. Apparently, he was too busy to even talk to her. And so, when she walked out the door, the other was very upset. After all, she wanted to hear at least one kind word in her address. She wanted the best. But it turned out as always, just terrible, all to fulfill. The girl went to her bedroom and, lying down on her bed, thought about the fact that she knew absolutely nothing and decided not to interfere anymore. She thought that everything would work itself out somehow. Delise was ready to cry, but then suddenly she wondered how things were further along in the novel, in order to orient herself at least a little to the events. In Colors of the Imperial Court, the protagonist is the crown prince of the empire, Astrid, and the protagonist is an angelic princess of the small kingdom of Jalea, named Grace. In order to ensure the safety of the kingdom, the princess was sent to this particular empire, and then the protagonist and heroine begin to fall in love with each other gradually, but still confidently. And Roan, who knew absolutely nothing about it, stays on the princess's good side. But after that, the girl, no matter how hard she tried to remember, she couldn't do it. And she even panicked and couldn't believe that she had really forgotten everything. But she tried to reassure herself, because she remembered that back in the original, there had been a war of conquest. If this is indeed the case, then the Astrid Empire did not intend to exactly start this war, and the defenders were the Empire's neighbors. These include the Kingdom of Caroline and the Kingdom of Medici, and after the former kingdom made an alliance with the barbarians, the Empire of Astrid entered the war in order to end it already at last. Of course, as a result of the war, the Kingdom of Caroline was defeated, and although the war ended quite well, but because of the betrayal of an ally, Roan was wounded and became lame, even on one leg. And his wife, Delise, seeing this, showed absolutely no sympathy at all, but only smiled and laughed at him the whole time. And it was at that point that Roan, unable to stand all her abuse, so he requested a divorce from this horrible girl. And now that the girl remembered all of this, she realized that this should never happen. And since she was now in her body, she would not allow Roan to be hurt, and would not allow this divorce to happen under any circumstances. At the time the girl found herself in this affair, it was spring, and Roan and Delise were divorcing in early fall. That horrible war lasted 2 whole months, and it started in the summer, so she didn't have as much time left as she would have liked. But still, Delis can't just tell that Carolyn's kingdom will make an alliance with the barbarians, and among the allies there is a traitor. She will be immediately interrogated where she got this information. And of course, no one would believe her if she said she had read about it in a novel. Everyone would immediately think she was crazy and take definite action. But at that moment, someone suddenly knocked on her door. It was Maria. She said she had come to tell the girl about the next day's schedule. Delis looked at the door in surprise and didn't understand what schedule she was even talking about. However, she allowed the maid to enter. As soon as the maid approached the bed, the girl, smiling, immediately inquired as to what there was planned for tomorrow. Maria was a little shy, but afterwards, she said that there would be a birthday banquet for Her Highness the Princess very soon. And her ladyship had been preparing for this banquet for days. But suddenly she forgot about it, just as she had forgotten about all other important matters. Delis, when she heard that, she immediately thought of this birthday banquet. Then she got up from the bed, saying that surely the crown prince would be there too. The maid was a little surprised at such a question, but said that was right. He was also invited to the event. And it is also rumored that this is the first time a princess from the kingdom of Jalia is coming to such an event. Delis, when she heard this, she immediately realized that this banquet would apparently be the place where the protagonist and heroine would meet for the first time. She immediately realized that there was no way she could miss such a chance, even though she wanted to refuse and not go to such an event, because she didn't like them very much. The girl was silent for a while, and then wondered if Roan wasn't going to come there. Mary, for her part, replied that the banquet was for a royal birthday, so the Duke would simply have to attend, even if he didn't want to. Then the girl realized that it was at this event even Roan will meet the main character of the novel, and of course, in the story he is not yet in love with the princess. Which means that Delis now has the best chance. The main characters will meet, and she needs to make it clear to the princess that Roan is in no way on her hook. And besides, she needs to show her husband himself that she has no interest in the crown prince, so he certainly won't be jealous. Suddenly, a maid approached the girl and asked if something was wrong. Delis, in turn, smiled and thought that they would still see at the banquet what she was capable of. And all because the girl was going to put absolutely all her efforts to make the prince and princess finally happy. And Roan was not so attached to the protagonist. And then the next day finally came, quite early. At lunchtime, he and Roan went to the event. The girl, sitting in the carriage, thought about the fact that even the air felt a little heavier, and she couldn't believe how tense it was because of their past conversation. Delis was actually just incredibly underdressed, but even with all that, every time she looks at Roan, all she thinks about is how adorable he is. She could even stare at just his face all day without a break, and she certainly wouldn't get bored of it. But then suddenly, she realized that she was definitely not going to do that. She should talk to him more in order to discuss the war that was about to happen very soon. So, plucking up courage, the girl turned to Roan and inquired if he was often at such banquets. The man, for his part, didn't even look in her direction and simply said that he had to visit them quite often. Delis, when she heard this, was immediately happy and said that it was such a beautiful evening because the weather was not too hot. And there was a nice breeze, and his carriage was very comfortable. The man, still looking away, said that she was right after all. The girl then realized that he was a natural ice cube and would not say a word. But even with all that, there was no way she could stop thinking about him as a person and his looks, because he was just a beautiful character. Soon the carriage stopped, the doors opened, and thence came the voice of the butler, who turned to Mr. Duke and said he was very glad to see him. Delis, when she turned her head to the side, saw the huge estate and was very surprised, for she did not think they could arrive so quickly. Roan was the very first one out of the wagon and had already stepped aside, not even wanting to help his wife down. The girl realized that she couldn't get down on her huge shoes by herself, so she turned to Roan, saying that she was too high, and wondered if he could give her a hand. But the man only looked at her angrily. The girl replied that she could go down by herself, and she thought it too unfortunate to suggest that she should hold on to the handles. However, she would have to go down with her own feet, and at that moment Delis began to descend. But then suddenly her heel got stuck and she started to fall. The girl thought about how this would be the ultimate embarrassment. But then suddenly Roan ran up to her and managed to grab her. When she noticed it, she thought that it was just fabulous luck. And then, looking at her husband in surprise, she wondered if he had really picked her up so she wouldn't fall. The man immediately put her back in the carriage and said in a cold voice that she might not thank him for it. He gave her his hand afterward, and Delise said she was still incredibly grateful to him, because he had caught her after all, and she hadn't embarrassed herself in front of everyone. The man's face showed no reaction, and unfortunately, she couldn't figure out what he was even thinking. But after that, they went to the manor in silence. Roan said it was time for them to go in, so they wouldn't be late. As soon as they opened the doors, the butler immediately announced to all the guests present that they had arrived. Delise, as soon as she stepped inside, was very surprised. You see, it was quite spacious and very expensive. Oh, and besides, all the guests who had already arrived a little earlier were staring straight at them as they passed. The girl, looking around, could not find where the members of the royal family were. As far as she could remember, the emperor had a wife and even a concubine. The ruler did indeed marry twice. The first wife was the empress. She gave birth to a daughter and a son, Prince Cameron and Princess Sophia. The concubine also had children with the ruler. It was a second prince and a second princess, but unfortunately the empress died too soon. So the concubine became the ruler's second wife, and after becoming empress, she wanted to make her son the crown prince. Then the butler's voice spoke, asking for everyone's attention. He said that His Highness Crown Prince Cameron and Her Highness Princess Sophia had arrived. All the guests immediately started looking at them and admiring them. And Delise thought about the fact that the crown prince ended up being Cameron, who just happens to be the main character in the novel. She straight up glared at this guy who was passing by and thought that his looks really matched his status. She thought he was a pretty good-looking guy. But of course she liked Roan better, so she quickly stopped looking at the crown prince and shifted her gaze to her husband. He then in turn wondered if she liked it that much. However, his face was rather stern. The girl could not believe that he was looking at her so intently, for it seemed to her, even for a while, that her heart would just jump out of her chest. Then Delise wondered why he was suddenly asking her if she liked him, and assumed it was probably about him. So she said, smiling, that of course she liked the man. To this he answered nothing. He just looked at her for a while. And after that, the Duke simply turned around and without saying a single word, began to leave. The girl was very surprised, not understanding what had happened and what she had said wrong. But at that moment, she heard the voice of the crown prince behind her, turning to Roan, asking if it was his close friend. As soon as the girl turned around, she was very surprised, for she didn't realize when they had even been able to become such friends with the crown prince. Roan, stepping closer to him, bowed and saluted. "I am thus the future son of the empire." The girl immediately understood how to say hello in this place, so she immediately repeated after her husband. However, the crown prince didn't even hear her words. He turned to the Duke and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time, and he had even managed to miss him. Delise was simply surprised and humiliated. She couldn't believe that she had just been blatantly ignored. She certainly realizes that it's been a while since they've seen each other. However, in her opinion, the crown prince could have at least observed manners. Since Roan is the head of the emperor's faction, naturally he couldn't help but get close to the crown prince. Later, when they began to vie for attention, their friendship became more problematic. But at that moment, Sophia suddenly came up to her and said hello to Duchess Delisa, immediately bowed and said that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. The girl agreed, and then said she'd heard that Delise was still wasting her powers on that useless Shachotka. She looked at Sophia in surprise and wondered, what is she even talking about? The princess in turn laughed and asked, has she decided to play dumb? Then the girl, after a bit of thought, realized what this princess was probably talking about. And turning to Sophia, she asked, does she mean that Delise wanted to take the place of the empress? And if that's what she means, then the girl can definitely not worry. Right now, she only has plans to put her energies into really important things. When the princess heard this, she was genuinely surprised, and then asked, is it really true? Delise smiled smugly and replied that it was just that. But at that moment, the men came up to them, and she turned her attention to the crown prince. The girl said hello and said they hadn't seen him in a while. Cameron looked at her in surprise and said that was right. They hadn't seen each other in a long time. And Delise, in turn, smiling radiantly, inquired how he had spent all this time. The Crown Prince was very surprised and looked at her warily, but then said that he was fine. The girl herself thought at that moment that he might not make such an expression, because she didn't care about him at all now. Surely the original characters were sticking it to him every chance they got, and she even felt ashamed of her actions, since she was doing all this while her husband was alive. Then Delise, smiling, said she was doing well too, all because she had married such a fine man as his friend, and she actually said that she couldn't tell him how lucky she was to have met him. Roan was incredibly shocked when he heard this. There was a long silence between them all. Then Sophia spoke up and said that this was new. Then she raised her voice, addressing the Duchess, and all the people present immediately began to turn around and look at them. Delise suddenly giggled and apologized, saying that she must be taking up too much of their time. So turning around, she said that in that case she'd be on her way. But at that moment Roan grabbed her arm and pulled her close to him. She looked at him in surprise. The man suddenly began to lead her away from the hall. The girl kept turning to him, asking where they were going, but he didn't answer. Soon afterward, they went out on a small veranda, and the man, turning to the girl, inquired why she had said this in the first place. Delise looked at him in surprise and said she had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. Then the man turned to her and said that before His Highness had called their meeting with her good fortune and wondered what that even meant. Banning for his wife was never good fortune, rather even the biggest mistake of her life. And besides, it was the Crown Prince who made that maiden's heart flutter and fall in love when he saw her surprised expression. He asked if she now realized that she hated him with all her soul. The girl was silent for a while. Then she turned to Roan and said that she had no idea how he knew her, but she felt nothing for the Crown Prince. Roan suddenly started yelling loudly, asking how she could be sure of that, since not long ago she couldn't even take her eyes off him. The girl then looked at him and asked, "Does he really not realize who really makes her heart beat more often?" Roan was silent for a while. Then he looked sternly at the girl and said that the person she liked was the Crown Prince and no one else. Delise, indignant, wondered if he was even listening to her. But the man interrupted her and said he hadn't fully realized her memory loss yet and was misunderstanding everything. He also said that when her memory came back to her, she would still regret the words she had said. Delise was ready to cry. She found it all strange, for the man was acting as if he sincerely hated her. She didn't understand why he was making such a strange expression on his face. They were silent for a while, and then she said she wanted to tell him again that she didn't love the Crown Prince. But then suddenly she felt a strong headache. The girl suddenly couldn't stand on her feet, because everything in front of her eyes began to swirl and blur. Delise almost fell over. However, if Roan hadn't been standing next to her, it really would have happened. He ran over to her and immediately picked her up so she wouldn't hurt herself. The man looked at her in surprise and concern, and wondered what had happened to her. Was she not well? She didn't say anything for a while. Then, looking him straight in the eye, she said she wasn't at all. She was just a little dizzy all of a sudden. He set her back down and asked, "Is she really dizzy?" The girl averted her gaze and replied that he really didn't need to worry. She was fine. She herself at that moment realized why it had happened, for she had not eaten a drop of food since morning because of the need to fit into that dress. She immediately explained the situation to Roan, and said that it was probably because of that. The man said in all seriousness that it was obvious that starvation could cause fainting. Delise turned the other way and said that unlike his body, hers was contentedly weak, and that was why things were like this. He was silent for a while, and then looking at his wife, suggested returning to the mansion. Delise looked at him in surprise and asked why he suddenly decided so. After all, they had just arrived. But he then asked seriously, "Does she really think it's important now?" And he also wondered if she suddenly fainted in the middle of the conversation, what she would tell him to do. Delise thought at that moment that it was very much like a man worrying about her. She stood for a while longer, and then he told her to hurry up. Soon they were downstairs, and the wagon had arrived. As soon as the man climbed in, he immediately held out his hand to her so she could get in well without any trouble. The girl, when she saw this gesture, she immediately even blushed. She didn't expect him to really offer her help, but she put her hand in his and thanked him. As soon as they sat down, the wagon immediately set off. When she saw the look on his face, Delise realized that he must be really worried about her health. They were silent for a while, and then the girl, turning to Roan, said he was more careful and cautious. She asked, "Is it because he's worried about her?" But the man, without even looking her in the eye, said it wasn't that at all. Delise sighed heavily then and thought about the fact that he could have said he was worried just once. Nothing catastrophic would have come of it, but she thanked him for it anyway. Roan replied that he'd already told her it was because of the starvation. If she'd eaten properly, he wouldn't have had to do all this. But the girl smiled anyway, thanking him for actually caring, even over this. Roan didn't say anything to that and said she could think what she wanted. The rest of the trip they were in silence. Shortly afterward, the girl finally opened her eyes and called for the maid. Marie immediately ran into the room, and when she saw Mistress, she was glad that she was finally awake. Delise looked at her in surprise and said that she had been in a carriage after all, so she didn't understand how she was even in this place. The maid immediately came close to her and told her that she had slept for 24 hours without waking up at all. The girl was very surprised. She could not believe that she had fallen asleep while riding in the carriage, but she assumed that it was probably because she was tired. Maria also said that last night the gentleman didn't know what to do with her, so he brought Delise into the bedroom. Surprised, she looked at her and asked, "Is it really true? He carried her in his arms?" It was rather hard for the girl to believe it, but the maid confirmed this information and said that he also looked very puzzled. But she also thought about the fact that nothing serious seemed to have happened. Then she asked the maid, "Where is he now?" Maria replied that the gentleman had gone to the imperial palace rather early in the morning, because he had some business to attend to there. When she heard this, she was very surprised and asked, "Is it really true?" She also wondered if he had accidentally told her when he would be back. The maid got a little upset and said he didn't speak. However, he said to watch over Mistress all the time, and at that moment, yes, or I suddenly choked on the water I was drinking. The maid was immediately frightened and asked if she was all right, for all her clothes were soaked. She said she was fine, but she couldn't believe that Roan had actually told her to watch her. Mary left immediately and said she would bring new clothes right away, for her not to sit in the wet. Delise thought about the fact that even though what he was saying didn't reflect his character, she was still glad. When Mary began to change the bedclothes, for they too were wet, she said that the Marquis would come in the afternoon, for he too was very anxious about her health. When the girl heard this, she realized that if the Marquis came, he would be talking about Delise's father. She couldn't believe that the rumors had spread so quickly. She'd been sick only the night before, but she had told the maid that she understood and would take it under advisement. The girl realized that if he paid a visit after lunch, she still had time. She realized that if he visited after lunch, it would mean she still had time. The girl got out of bed, changed her clothes, and then went out into the hallway. As soon as she did that, she immediately even cheered up. She felt much better. As she looked around, she realized that she was indeed in a novel. After all, only in a fictional story could a house be so arranged and decorated. The manor was so huge that if you were not used to it, you could easily get lost and for quite a long time. But then suddenly, she saw a room ajar, and she immediately wondered what was in there. So she opened the door and saw that it was a secret passage to a dungeon. She wondered if there was anything down there at all, so she decided to go down and check it out, even though she was pretty scared to go into places like this. And soon Delise found herself at the very bottom. But it was empty. She could not believe that there was nothing special in this secret room, and it made her very sad. But then suddenly, as she rounded the corner, she saw a strange brown door. It was unusual because it was different from the design of the rest of the manor. Even the pen was very different on it, as if it depicted something, and it had a bright golden light, as if it were magical. The girl was very wary, because nothing was mentioned in the book, and she became very curious as to what could even be behind this mysterious and beautiful, at the same time, door. Delise was about to open the door when suddenly she heard the maid's voice asking where she had gone. Maria said that the Marquis had already arrived, so she had to go to meet him. The girl was very surprised that he had passed so quickly, for she had not yet had time to see anything at all. She was annoyed that this was happening now. She had no other choice but to go upstairs. She decided to ask Roan a little later, because there was no one else to ask about such secret passages. As soon as she got up, the maid sent her to meet the Marquis. Delise went out into the garden and she could not believe that he had to come to this place. She'd thought they'd meet in the parlor, have a quick cup of tea, and go their separate ways. As soon as she stepped out into the courtyard, she immediately saw a rather young guy. He stood up and said hello to the girl. She thought that he must be her father, but Delise hesitated, because he was middle-aged and didn't look like anyone's father. The man, in turn, came closer to her and asked if she was all right. The girl was starting to get gradually nervous, but she had to act naturally, so she replied that she was fine, and began to walk over to the small table that stood in the middle of the gazebo. She smiled and said that as he himself would notice, she was perfectly fine, so he needn't worry. She herself thought about whether she had answered naturally enough for her character. Her father in turn became wary and asked what her official look was. He said she could call him Daddy as usual, and then he suddenly wondered, worriedly, if maybe she just hadn't recovered yet and was still sick. Delise was very surprised, for she had not even realized that her character could call her father informally. Then the man put his hand on her forehead and asked if she had a fever or a fever. The girl continued to sit there without answering, thinking that she, too, would have to call him Daddy to avoid being singled out. The man offered to call the family doctor if she was still unwell. Delise smiled and said it was completely unnecessary. She just suddenly wanted to add officialdom, so he needn't worry about it. The man laughed and said it must have been her joke. He called her his darling daughter and said she was very original. Delise continued to smile and thought that she was probably only nice to her own father and treated everyone else as something unpleasant. Soon the maid brought them tea and some desserts, and the man, with a serious expression on his face, inquired how she had been doing at all lately. The girl noticed by the look on his face that he was worried about her family life and wanted to know how things were going with the Duke. He also asked if she was having a hard time, and the girl replied that everything was fine. Roan treats her very well and everything is calm. When her father heard this, he was very surprised and asked if it was true, because she had always dreamed of becoming an empress, and in this case she probably wouldn't succeed. Delise explained that she had decided to give up her goal of becoming empress. She would rather be with Roan than dream of being empress, and it would be quite a challenge to realize it. His father laughed and said that it made sense to him now. He added that that was probably why he had sent Roan the letter as soon as Delise had gotten sick. When the girl heard this, she was surprised and asked if Roan had really done it. The man replied that he had been surprised when he received the letter from Roan, but now that all was well, he was very happy for his daughter. Delise looked at her father in surprise and still couldn't understand how he knew about it. Now she knew that Roan had sent him a letter. She realized that Roan was actually worried about her health, even though he had said otherwise at the party. It was pleasant and unusual for her to meet a man so willing to hide his kindness and sincerity. She decided to find out more and asked what exactly Roan had written in his letter to his father. At that moment, the maid began to pour their tea. However, just as her father was about to answer the question, Delise accidentally dropped the cup and burned her hand with the hot tea, causing her to scream loudly in pain. Her father came closer to Delise, asked if she was all right, and asked to see the wound from her burned hand. The maid, in turn, began to apologize for what had happened. Delise replied that she was fine. She was just scared and had a small burned wound from the hot water. The maid realized her mistake and fell to her knees, apologizing to Delise for what had happened. Delise reassured the maid, telling her that everything was fine and there was no need to worry so much. She realized that the wound was minor and there was no need for any serious measures. However, the maid continued to believe she was guilty and begged for mercy. Delise stood up and hugged the maid, assuring her that everything was fine. Delise offered the maid a wet, cold towel to ease the burn, which surprised the maid and elicited thanks. The maid thanked Delise for her kindness and said she would bring a towel now. At that moment, my father noticed how much Delise had changed and what wonderful qualities she now possessed. Father began to show his emotions, saying that he always knew what Delise was really like and how happy he was that she had become more caring and friendly, despite the rumors about her temper. Father expressed his pride in Delise and said she had grown up to be just as he had always seen her. He also mentioned that her brother and sister have different personalities and can't find common ground, and asked if Delise could help them get along. Delise began to wonder about the differences between them, but thought the problem was more about their personalities than their characters. They spent some more time together walking around the estate, and by evening my father was ready to say goodbye. The wagon arrived and they began to say goodbye as the sun was already setting over the horizon. Father expressed relief to learn that Delise was doing well and asked me to send his regards to the Duke for him. And Delise replied that she would be sure to say hello and wished him a careful journey. After her father's departure, Delise felt tired of playing the other man in front of her father. As she prepared to return to the manor, she noticed Roan's carriage pulling up to it. At first she didn't realize who it was, but then she saw that it was Roan's carriage and realized that he had come to get her. Delise thought to herself that if she had known she would have to meet him, she would have dressed up. But as soon as the carriage stopped near the entrance, the man opened the door, and at that moment, when he had already gone out, he saw the girl and was very much surprised with surprise. He even stopped. He frowned and wondered, why did she even come out since she's still too weak? However, Delise ignored him and just ran towards him, smiling happily. She thought about the fact that even though they had a bad relationship, they didn't hug. However, in her opinion, it wouldn't be a big deal if she did it once. Roan, however, saw her coming and immediately stepped aside. He was surprised to see what was wrong with the girl, running into nowhere with her arms outstretched. She felt incredibly embarrassed and realized that she had been a little hasty with the hug. So she resented him, asking why he was even asking what she was doing since she was glad to see him. Though they had seen all day long without seeing each other, so she wanted to greet him. Roan, for his part, turned around and asked, "Is she really happy to see him? Her exactly?" The girl followed him and wondered, "Is there really anyone else in this place besides her?" She stood in his way and with a smile on her face asked him how his journey had been and if everything had been peaceful. But when she saw his surprised and worried look, she was very surprised and thought that she must have gone a little overboard. But Roan said he had done well. He smiled and, calling her his dear, said he was back. Oh, when Delise heard this, she was so surprised that she was even speechless. She couldn't believe that he smiled like that and called her his dear. But immediately realizing his actions, the man removed the smile from his face and became serious again, saying that it was already time for them to return to the manor, for it was getting dark outside. Delise at that moment doubted if he really smiled just at her, or if he just didn't recognize her and was in a good mood that he couldn't even contain his emotions. She was sure she hadn't imagined it. Then she saw him leaving, so she ran up to him and looked him straight in the face and asked him if it was true that he had smiled. Roan walked simply forward and answered her nothing. Of course he didn't. Not even when they got back to the manor. The girl immediately changed her clothes and they went together for dinner. However, no one said a single word, and that made Delise tense. Then with a smile on her face, to lighten the atmosphere, she asked if it was true that he liked the food that day too. Roan didn't say anything to that and just kept eating. The girl couldn't believe that even when he was just eating food, he was so cute. And with those beautiful cheeks, it reminded her directly of a squirrel chewing on her nut that she had waited a long time for. The man was silent for a while and never answered her question. Then he decided to change the subject by looking at her hand, saying also that he had heard that she had hurt herself in the morning. Delise immediately grabbed at her burn and smiled and replied that it was no big deal, just a little doused tea. But the man continued to insist and said that he had also heard that she had spared the delinquent maid. The girl kept smiling and said that was right. She hadn't done anything to be punished by execution and her arm hardly hurt at all, so it was okay. Roan took a napkin to wipe her mouth and said that mercy had never been out of the question before, even if because of a drop of tea on the floor, let alone spilling it on her very self. He also said with a smile on his face that this time she was, to his surprise, contentedly generous. Delise didn't even know what to say to that, and she herself couldn't believe that even situations like that even existed, and realized that her character was the worst. It was just no wonder she ended up being banished just from the Empire. Then she inquired in a trembling voice what had happened in such a case to this maid. The man replied that he wrote her a letter of recommendation and sent it to her. Instead of getting better, she should be fine at this point. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really written her a recommendation. Roan replied that of course he had, and he didn't think it was anything special. Delise thought at that moment that he was simply the sweetest and best person in the world, and then, smiling, said that it was incredibly sweet and noble of him to do that. But Roan suddenly became very serious and said that she was talking nonsense. The girl was indignant and replied that, although he kept saying he was not like that, she saw the opposite. He looked at her in surprise and asked, "Did she really remember it?" The girl answered that she did not remember anything, but just felt it and knew this special feeling, which unfortunately she could not explain to him. The man didn't respond to that, and Delise kept thinking that he was incredibly sweet, even when he was confused. But then she suddenly remembered her day's adventures and realized that she needed to ask him about that door in the basement. She decided to do it now, while he was in a good mood. She turned to Roan and said that she was curious about something in the basement. She had seen a door during the day when she was walking around that was different from all the others, and inquired if she could ever go in there. The man replied that she must have found the armory. There is a legend that there are a lot of weapons stacked there, so many that they are passed down from generation to generation. Delise was very surprised at that moment. She couldn't believe that the Vanister family was so honorable that it had kept weapons for generations. She then inquired as to who had the keys to the place. The man replied that he had them. Delise realized that she was being a little insistent. However, she was genuinely curious. She said she was so curious and would like to see, so she asked him if he could let her in to see the whole place just once. The girl at that moment thought about the fact that her character was certainly insanely beautiful. However, her feminine charms would not work on Roan. Then the man suddenly frowned and wondered, why is she even looking at him like that? Delise decided to really try and lure him with her charms. However, it didn't work, unfortunately. Then the man got up from his seat and said that from the beginning, there were no places in this house where she was not allowed. However, there are a lot of rather dangerous weapons there, so he suggests that she go together so that everything will go safely. He started to leave, saying that she should wait in her room as soon as she finished dinner. He would take her there, and they would look at everything, just as she wanted. Delise was immediately happy and clapped her hands and said she would be sure to wait for him afterward. She ate quickly and went upstairs to her room. She sat by the window with a cup of tea and waited for the man, wondering what was kept behind that door after all. In fact, in the novel, in the war when Roan is trapped, she remembers that his sword even broke during the battle, and he was injured because of it. Of course, since she is now Delise's character, she won't let him get hurt like this. Though she doesn't know the details, she hopes he goes in with a solid sword for this battle. Then she suddenly wondered if the strongest sword in this world could exist, and she shifted to thinking that there might be some magical creatures here. Things that have been created with magic are pretty good, so tools made from elven materials are very survivable, especially if the magical weapon was made of a material as strong as diamond. But one that could be shattered with her hands, and no matter how much you blast it, it was definitely, as she knew, indestructible. If the humans learn of this ability of the elves, they will certainly begin to exploit them in horrible conditions, even keep them. That is why all magical creatures and elves live by hiding and staying out of sight of anyone alive, to save their lives and avoid slavery to humans. There was even an episode in the novel about rescuing elf slaves, and Delise knows exactly where they live. So she had one brilliant idea in her head, how she could save a man and make him feel good.